But for almost, I guess, 17 years now, we have tried to make the case for Christianity. Here's what I say often. The evidence that Christianity is true is overwhelming, but I'm amazed at how few people actually are familiar with the evidence and comfortable with the evidence, either considering it if you're a skeptic or in conveying it if you are a believer. So tonight we're going to talk about the historical reliability of the New Testament. And that's maybe like a fairly small subject, but one of the things that is unique about Christianity compared to other world religions and the great faith traditions, one of the things that's unique about Christianity is that it is history dependent. It is dependent on history. Matter of fact, there's a historian named Houston Smith, who wrote a book on the religions of the world, and when he got to Christianity, here's what he said. He said, Christianity is unique among the religions of the world in that it is dependent on historical accuracy. And if you think about it, we're not going to talk about this necessarily tonight, but the whole basis for Christianity is an historical event, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So all this leads to, now where we're headed, and we may not get there tonight, but if the Bible is the inspired Word of God, then you would expect it to be accurate in any historical claims that it makes. So that's what we're investigating. In a sense, we're going to treat the Bible like any other ancient work, any other ancient book of literature. And I think when we do that, we'll find out that the Bible is not like any other ancient work at all. Here's an interesting thought to kind of begin with, and hopefully get your brain start working and your mind start rolling here. Most people think, or maybe not most people, a lot of people seem to think that every culture, every place in the world, every small people group, every ethnic group has a book that they consider to be the inspired Word of God. And so we're just kind of one of many. Christianity and the Bible, and in particular tonight, the New Testament, we just kind of are one of the many who are lost in the crowd, and we pick that one to believe. But the truth is there are only 3 books that I know of that claim to be inspired by God. Now other cultures, other even religions may have sacred writings, but partly because of their view of God himself or their theistic worldview, they don't consider that they have a book is actually inspired by God. For example, if you are a Hindu, you believe that the oneness of all things, they call him the Brahman, not really him. The Brahman's the oneness of all things, but the Brahman doesn't speak at all. It's just the oneness of all things. So even though they have sacred writings, of course, they don't think that they were inspired by God, but were written by maybe ascended masters. So only 3 books that I know of that claim to be inspired by God. One, of course, is the Old and New Testament, the Bible. The other one would be Quran, and the other one would be, can you guess, the Book of Mormon. Now here's the deal with that. Both the Book of Mormon and the Quran are based on, they're based on the Bible. And they both make the claim that the reason that they are necessary, if you're a Muslim, you believe the Quran corrects the Bible because the Bible had been corrupted for those years. Let's say the Quran was written, in the 600s. And so in the 600 years after the New Testament was written, or 500 years after the New Testament was written, Muslims would say that had become corrupted, and so Allah, God, gave us the Quran to straighten everything out. The Book of Mormon says basically the same thing. So here, my point is, we're not going to really deal with this tonight because we're talking about history. But if they cannot make the case that the New Testament in particular has been corrupted, then they've kind of lost their need for existence. If we have a good copy of the original writings of the Bible, if we have good copies now, then by their own argument, they are unnecessary. And let me deal with one historical issue here. The Quran, for example, would say that Jesus was never crucified. Now, they would say that somebody was crucified. They think that an imposter or somebody was switched at the last minute, and that God fooled everybody because he would not allow his son. Remember, Muslims do believe that Jesus, he's not the son of God. They think of him as a major prophet. They think he was born of a virgin. And so they do have a sort of a high view. Yeah.
Hey, Dan.
Yes.
Leslie says that the sound doesn't seem to be working.
Well,
No, we got sound here.
I got sound here.
Yeah.
So what do I do?
Just hang tight a second.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for the help.
Okay. Howard Oppenheim says it is working.
Ah, okay. Hi, Howard. I'm so glad to hear your name. Oh, I miss Howard.
Okay.
He's a
D.E.
good friend.
Saxon says got audio. So we've got some folks. Leslie, check your volume.
Okay. So I didn't do anything wrong?
Nope.
Good. Good. I told you this was our first adventure.
Yeah, really. Okay. Well, let's. Okay. We'll just carry on then. And so thanks, Howard and DE, for letting us know that you guys have audio. Nope. And just so you know, I'm Peter. I'm your disembodied voice for a few minutes while Dan continues. So, Dan, go ahead and pick it up.
Okay. So we're talking about the Quran's claim that Jesus was not crucified. Remember that even without the Bible, historians like Josephus and Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, we would know that Jesus was crucified historically from a purely historian's perspective, even if we didn't have the New Testament. We would also know, get this, we would know that the Apostle Paul was in Corinth in the year 50 AD. And Paul, of course, could have been a witness. I don't know that he was, but he could have been a witness at the crucifixion. But Paul was preaching within just 20 years or so, less than that, he was preaching within a couple of years. But he's writing the book of 1 Corinthians to the Corinthian church. He had been visiting there 50 years. That's only 20 years after Jesus was crucified, and the central message of the church has always been the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So there is so much historical evidence that Jesus was crucified, and there's evidence, we wouldn't need the Bible to know, that the disciples truly believed that God raised him from the dead. That's why they were willing to be martyred for that. And so history is, let me just say it this way, history is on the side of Christianity. The Christian faith is based on historical events. Now, when we start talking about the historical reliability of the New Testament, we're not talking about the miraculous things that are, I'm going to say it this way, I think there's good evidence for them, but they're not verifiable in the same way that other historical, just normal historical events are reliable. And what we're going to show, and how many times it takes to do that, I don't know, but what we're going to show is that it is absolutely remarkable how historically accurate the New Testament is. It's amazing. It's virtually perfect. I don't know of any, if you do know of something, I don't know of any single historical claim that the New Testament makes that has been disproven by other literature of that period, that time period. And so I want to talk to you now about two, what I would call key phrases. The first key phrase would be oral tradition. It's commonly believed that the New Testament in particular was the product, let's say, of a few generations of storytelling. So if you get in your mind and imagine this, you got the Jesus crowd in the first century. Jesus is living and preaching, and he's got followers, and he's crucified, and whatever happened. I think God raised him from the dead. But his disciples then, after his death, are telling stories about Jesus. And the word is spreading, of course. Well, no doubt that did happen. But the idea of oral tradition is that those stories became the tradition, the Christian tradition. And maybe after 2 or 3 generations, they were finally written down. But by that time, they had changed a lot. Every community had adapted them to fit their own needs. They were embellished, of course. And so that became a very popular view in the late 18th century, even in theological schools. And so from that idea of oral tradition, so when you hear that word, oral traditions, and if you watch the History Channel or public television around Easter time or sometimes around Christmas time, you'll hear that. These are the oral traditions. These are the stories that have been told and finally got written down. Well, that makes the New Testament not very reliable at all. So the term, the scholarly term that goes with that is the term form criticism. During the 1800s, it basically started from a couple of German religious schools. The idea is that we want to find out what form the New Testament originated from. What is the real source of the New Testament? Now, this is really basic and really important. Did the New Testament, and I'll actually show it here, did the New Testament come from those oral traditions? Was that the form, and it's form criticism, was that the form that produced the New Testament? So we're reading stories that were told for generations, and who knows how accurate they were? Probably not at all. Now keep in mind, there are cultures that have oral traditions that don't write anything down. And what's amazing is they're actually pretty accurate, but that's not the case with the New Testament. What the New Testament claims is that it is the product written during, listen to this, the product of living memory. Let me just quote you a couple of verses here. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16. The Apostle Peter says, "We did not devise cunning fables and myths, but we were eyewitnesses," and there's that key word there, we were eyewitnesses of His majesty. I'll give you another, the Apostle John in his epistle, 1 John. He says, "That which we have seen, that which we have heard, that which our hands have handled, even the word of life, this we declare unto you." So both those guys are claiming to be eyewitnesses of what they're writing. And so it's very different. Think about it. It's very different to think of the New Testament as the product of eyewitness testimony than it is to think of the New Testament as oral traditions that were passed down from generation to generation of storytelling. 1933, a guy named Vincent Taylor, who was a biblical scholar, he said, if the form critics are right, then the original, this is important too, the original disciples must have been translated to heaven with Jesus, because there was nobody around apparently that actually knew what happened. So let me explain to you another way. Richard Dawkins, I've heard him say this a couple of times. Nobody that actually knew Jesus wrote the New Testament. The New Testament was not written by anybody who actually knew Jesus. I'll give you this one here too. This is a quote from the late great Christopher Hitchens, who wrote God is Not Great, How Religion Spoils Everything. In that book, here's what he says: "The New Testament is a crude work of carpentry, hobbled together long after its purported events," that's the key, oral traditions, long after its purported events, and full of improvised attempts to make things come out right. Now, and this is a huge issue here, so I want to give you another guy, just in case you're interested, if you're writing things down. Richard Bauckham is one of the great New Testament scholars. He is a member of the British Academy of Sciences. He teaches at several different universities. And he wrote a book called, guess what, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I'll give you another great scholar, Swedish scholar Samuel Berskog. And here's what they say. Now, this is important. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they would include Acts, were undeniably written within living memory of the events that they recount. I want to read that again. The Gospels were undeniably written within living memory of the events that they recount. Now, you might be saying, what's the evidence for that? And you'd be right in saying that. So the first point that I would like to make in support of that premise, and I hope you see how huge that is, you might even say, and I'll get back to this, you might even say, well, even if they were eyewitnesses, weren't they biased? Yes, they were very biased. Kind of like the eyewitnesses of the Holocaust were biased. It doesn't mean they were biased to tell a lie. The most reasonable position would be, yeah, they were biased, they believed it, and so they were committed to telling the truth. It was their purpose to tell what they actually saw, and that's why Peter says, we didn't make this up. That's what he's saying. We were eyewitnesses of His Majesty. We did not make this up. Now, the first point I want to make to support that is this. It's not that much different today than it was in the first century regarding the standards for historical documents. There are a lot of great historians that the only reason we know anything about the ancient world is because we have ancient historians. Even if you read Edward Gibbon's The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, you're reading what Edward Gibbons read from the guys that he can get that were writing about the Roman Empire during the time, shortly thereafter. Now here's my point. The standard for historical writings in the first century, the standard, you better do it this way. The standard was, guess what? Eyewitness testimony. From those, not just eyewitness testimony, but from those who had an invested interest in the events that they were writing about. The best historian, according to first century standards, and I can show you that. I don't need the Bible to show you that. I can show you that from a vast source of first century documents, or earlier than even first century documents, or a little later than first century documents. The greatest historical reliability was considered to be someone who was actually writing, who was involved in the events. The perfect example would be the Jewish historian Josephus. He's an interesting guy. He was a Jewish general. He was a commander of the Jewish forces when they revolted against Rome in 66 AD, and he was in charge of the troops in Galilee. Unfortunately, they were totally wiped out, just about, and he surrendered his troops to the emperor and to the Roman general. And then, because he was so good at recording these events, as an eyewitness who was a part of the events, he went to work for the Romans. He came back with Titus when Titus conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD, which would have been 4 years later. And as an eyewitness, he wrote his account of he called them the Jewish Wars. He wrote, so his two works, one is the Jewish Wars, the other one is Antiquities of the Jews. He was an eyewitness for all these things, and he commended his works. That's the neat thing. He commended his works by the testimony of the emperor and the generals who hired him to recount those events. Other ancient historians, let me just, and I'm not trying to show off here, I'm just because I haven't written down. Ancient historians, Xenophon, Greek historian. Did I pronounce that right? Thucydides, I think I got that one right. Xenophon, Thucydides, those are Greek historians. Nothing to do with Christianity. Josephus, of course, the Jewish historian. Two Roman historians, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger. And those are the guys that tell us what happened in the Mediterranean world and the Roman Empire in ancient history. That's how we know. And their standard was exactly the same as the standard of the New Testament. That history, here's what they said, history must be written down within living memory of the events. So it's not just the New Testament that makes that claim, it's all the other great historians of that period. So it should be no surprise then. Surely this makes sense. It should be no surprise that the New Testament fits that criterion. If it was written in the first century, then why would they not? And by the way, it had to be written in the first century, and that was going to play out in a lot of different ways here as we move forward. As we do this, we'll also see that that's exactly, this criteria of eyewitness testimony is exactly what separates the New Testament, the canonical New Testament. And when I say canonical, I mean the canon, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the ones that are in our Bible. It's what separates those books from the so-called lost Gospels. None of the lost Gospels were written from living memory. The first point about the lost Gospels is they're not really historical anyway. They're usually a compilation of some kind of sayings that Jesus purportedly said, but they're not really history books anyway. But they're not written from living memory. They're not written in the first century. They could not, they meet the criteria of what Richard Dawkins says, that they were not written by anybody who actually knew Jesus. And we know that. And so do the critics know that. And so do the skeptics know that. So there's a great separation here between the New Testament itself and, let's say, the lost Gospels. I'll give you another cool example here. I'm going to read you a verse, okay? I hope that's allowed. Hey, it's my show. Just kidding. Galatians, if you happen to be doing this with me, Galatians chapter 1. And if you have trouble finding Galatians, just remember General Electric, Pepsi Cola, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. Galatians chapter 1, okay? So Paul is writing to the churches in Galatia, which is near Asia, what's now Turkey. And he says, I want you to know, brothers, I'm in chapter 1, verse 11. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preached is not something that man made up. Let me stop here. Send in, if you have questions or comments, please send them in. I'll stop. I'll pause. I'll try to answer the questions. And I have a lot of material, but I hope you do. I hope you write in some comments or questions. And I want you to make sure also, while I'm doing my little commercial here, I want you to make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. You're on it right now. So, and then hit the notification bell so when we keep doing this or we add some programs, you'll get notified for that. And also like our Facebook page. We just try to communicate and tie the two together a lot. Okay, back to New Testament, Galatians chapter 1, verse 11. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel I preached is not something that man made up. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not consult any man, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years, now watch this, then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem, and here's what my New International Version translates the Greek into. I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. Now, the key word there in the Greek is the word get acquainted. Guess what the word is in Greek? Hystereo. And you guess what word in English we get from the Greek word hystereo? You got it. History. Paul went to Jerusalem after 3 years to do history. And for him, history was comparing notes. As he said, I went up there to get acquainted. And he later says in chapter 2 of Galatians, 14 years later, he went back and did the same thing again to make sure that everybody was on the page. And he says, to make sure that I had not run my race in vain, to make sure that Peter and James and I were all preaching the same exact message. So he's researching, he's doing history. What happened to you, Peter? What happened to you, James? Because James was an unbeliever. The brother of Jesus was like Paul. He was an unbeliever. Very strict in his Judaism. Even comes out in the book that he writes, the book of James. And so can you imagine them comparing notes? What happened to you? What did you see? What did you learn? What do you understand the gospel to be? What is the central message that we're supposed to be speaking here and teaching? So what I'm saying is here that eyewitness testimony is the criterion of the day. If you're not a Christian, if you're trying to write good history in the first century, that's what you do. Now, so it should be no surprise the New Testament fits right into that genre, if you want to call it that, of historical writings, and that's exactly what they claim. Let me read you one other passage of Scripture here, and I've got it right here. Luke chapter 3. Now get this. Remember, Luke is not an apostle. He's an associate of the Apostle Paul, and I'm going to read you the first only two verses. And if you can, in Luke chapter 3, if you can count the number of historical references that Luke makes in these two verses, you're probably better than I am. You start talking, because every detail, every time he mentions a person or a place or a position or a title, those are historical claims. And so in two verses, here's what he says. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea. Let me show you how this works. So he's claiming a date, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. He's claiming a name and a title, Caesar. Pontius Pilate, there's a name, being governor, there's a title, of Judea. There's the place in which he served. So he's made 6 claims right there historically in just half of a sentence. It goes on. Pontius and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch, there's the title, of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. All that is Roman history. All that is based on the Roman calendars. All that in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. By the way, if you're interested in knowing what year that would be from our perspective, it's 29 AD. And so then he switches to the Jewish calendar. The Romans would have dated their calendars based on the reign of the emperors. The Jews would have dated their calendars, since at this point they had no real king. King Herod was off the scene by now. They would base their calendars on the rule of the high priest. So in verse 2 he says, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, and he says all that to say one little thing: the word of God came to John the son of Zechariah in the wilderness. So that's pretty remarkable. I just hope you're kind of overwhelmed with the idea that the New Testament is historical, and all these claims right here. I mean, I don't know how many, 16, 17, 18. You could probably find 20 historical claims in those two verses. Every one of them is spot on accurate. There is no other historical document that would dispute any of these things. Now I want to build a chronology here. It's important to recognize that the standard of the first century during the writing of the New Testament, and it wasn't written by nobody who knew Jesus. It was written by people who did know Jesus. It wasn't written after generations. It was written during the first century. That's why they claimed it was eyewitness testimony. That was the standard of the day anyway. I don't know that it would have ever gotten off the ground and spread throughout the Mediterranean world. You know, by the time the New Testament was finished in about 90 AD, Christianity had spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. Partly, no doubt, because of the message itself, the gospel, but surely because of the credit that were being put out, the New Testament as it was written. Let me just say it another way. I'm trying to say there's a lot of the question: how did the church, the first church, how did they pick which books to be in the New Testament? How did they pick which books where they thought were inspired and which books were not inspired? Listen carefully to this. The early church, the first century church, the apostolic church, took every book written about Jesus in the first century. Their number one criteria was, can we connect this book to an apostle? Did he write it or did he approve of it? That's why Luke gets a pass for not being an apostle and not even being Jewish, because he was a companion of the apostle Paul. That's why Mark gets a pass. Mark wasn't an apostle. He was Jewish, but he wasn't an apostle. He was the interpreter of the apostle Peter. Now we're going to see this carry on. So we'll stop there and park all that stuff. Now we're going to move forward one generation. Okay? So we've got the first generation of Christians here, writing history according to the standard of the day as eyewitnesses. Now we've got the second generation. Now they're not writing scripture. Why not? They weren't eyewitnesses. But their standard was exactly the same. So we call these second generation and third generation guys, they were leaders in the Christian church, we call them church fathers. I'll just name a couple of them and tell you just a little bit about them. What's the best way for me to do that? I'll name one and then I'll try to find a little bit of more notes here. But a guy named Papias. Papias lived, get this now, from 60 AD, all right, 60 AD to 130 AD. So he's a second generation, maybe you could say third generation Christian. He was the bishop of a town called Hierapolis, which is in Turkey now. In those days, of course, in the Roman Empire, they would call it Asia, but now it's in Turkey. His book is called, get this, The Exposition of the Logia, or Logos, of the Lord. Logos is just a Greek word for word. So if we said it a little more simply, he wrote Exposition of the Word of the Lord. 5 books. We don't have them. I'm sorry, we don't have them. But we know he wrote them because we have quotes of those books and descriptions of those books by other guys that we do have the writings of. And those guys, 2 of them are also church fathers, Eusebius and Irenaeus. Both of those are church fathers about one generation after Papias, so they knew him. And the neat thing about Papias is, what we know about him, of course, we know from what he wrote, but what was quoted. Papias knew the daughters of Philip the evangelist, because Philip, and when we say Philip the evangelist, if you read the book of Acts, he's a guy who led the Ethiopian eunuch to faith in Christ in Acts chapter 8, I want to say. And so Philip had 4 daughters who were prophetesses, and they all lived, they moved around some after that, but they all lived in Hierapolis. That's where Papias was. I don't know that Papias would have known Philip, but he did know the 4 daughters. As a matter of fact, if you go visit, I can't think of the name of the town in Turkey, but if you go visit this town, you can go visit the grave, the tomb of Philip the evangelist, because that's where he lived. So Papias would have been around, get this now, if he's born in 60, say 40 years later, about 100 AD, he's living during the time that the Gospels have been written and are being spread across the Roman Empire. And Paul, the apostle, died about the year, a couple of 3 years after Papias was born, and so he would have had access to those writings as well. Here's the amazing thing, and what I'm doing here is I'm trying to build a case for the New Testament having been written as the product of eyewitness testimony rather than oral tradition over generations. So remember, Papias is around and the New Testament is around. He might not have had access to every book, but all the ones Paul wrote, Paul circulated through Ephesus. Oh, that's in Turkey. Colossae, that's in Turkey. So those epistles would have been available to him. And the Gospels were being spread all over the place. Some of them were written from Rome, and we'll see later on about that. But Papias, even though he had access to those books that were considered inspired, he valued more highly than that the eyewitness testimony that he got from the students of the apostles themselves. So he lives in Hierapolis. Hierapolis is kind of an intersection of travel, great trade route. So as disciples of the apostles would come through, Papias said, I would get them, I would invite them, I would ask them questions. What was that apostle saying? And the neat thing is, he names. Here's who he names. He said, if somebody had been with the apostle Andrew, I wanted to talk to him. If somebody had been a student of the apostle Peter, I talked to them. If somebody had been a student of Philip, I talked to him. If somebody had been a student of the apostle Thomas, the real Thomas, not the Gospel of Thomas, I would talk to them. If somebody had been a student of James, the brother of Jesus, or the brother of Andrew, I'd talk to them. So he valued the eyewitness testimony of the students of the apostles even more than the writings of the apostles. That's how, what I'm trying to show you is how valuable and how the criteria of those early days, even the second generation, was eyewitness testimony. That's what they were all about. They call these people in Luke ministers of the word. So let me read you one more from Luke chapter 1 as he introduces his gospel here. He's going to tell you how he got this. So this is Luke chapter 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses, there it is again, and servants of the word. I hope you get it. This is a great insight into how these guys thought, what they valued, what they thought was important. So Luke, obviously, is writing this and commending this to be read and believed. And here's what he says. He says, others have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. He's probably talking about Matthew and Mark. Mark's considered the first gospel ever written. Matthew after that, Luke after that, John the last one, of course. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. And then it says, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Let's go back to that idea of oral testimony, oral tradition. When Luke or Papias wrote about oral traditions, they meant something very different than Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins means when they say that the New Testament wasn't written by anybody who knew Jesus, but was the product of oral traditions. They're thinking in terms of generations. When first century writers used that term, oral traditions or ministers of the word, handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about these eyewitnesses telling us what they saw, telling us what they heard personally. That for them was oral traditions. Kind of like Princess Bride. I don't think that word means what you think it means. And so that's the basis on which Luke is writing here. He says, therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, the guy he's writing to, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. That's remarkable. Now, let me read you now what Papias says. Okay, so remember, Papias is a second generation, late second generation, but he would have known at least some people who knew the apostles. He interviewed people who knew the apostles. He knew Philip's 4 daughters. So he's very close. And he's also a contemporary to another church father whose name is Polycarp. Polycarp, during his lifetime, he died, he was, let's see, where, Polycarp. He died in 156 AD. He was 86 years old. He's the guy who's famous for saying they wanted him to deny Christ. And he said, he hasn't denied me in 86 years. I'm not going to deny him now. And he was martyred. But he was the last living associate of an apostle. He was a disciple of the Apostle John. And so obviously, because he had an association with an eyewitness, he became an eyewitness to the eyewitness, and his testimony was so valued. And you can read in the church fathers that they talk about these things. So I'm going to read you something that Papias wrote in his prologue, and this is quoted again by Eusebius. So we have the writings of Papias, even though we don't have his actual writings or copies of his actual writings, but we do have Eusebius. Here's what he says. This is Papias. I shall not hesitate also to put into properly ordered form. It sounds like Luke. For you everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders, he calls the apostles elders, and noted down well, for the truth of which I vouch. Now, you have to listen to this and think, we're learning how they think. For unlike most people, I did not enjoy those who have a great deal to say, but those who teach the truth. Nor did I enjoy those who recall someone else's commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. And if by chance, here we go, anyone who had been in attendance on the elders, so he's looking for people who knew the apostles, should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders, that is, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip or Thomas, or James or John or Matthew, or any other of the Lord's disciples were saying. Now watch this. For I did not think, this is so key, don't miss this. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice. What I'm trying to show you here is that the standard of the New Testament was eyewitness testimony, and that standard carried on even after the New Testament was written. As long as there were eyewitnesses available, those eyewitnesses were relied upon. And I think that's pretty remarkable here. So, I don't know, do we have any questions? Anybody commenting or getting any questions here? We've been at it for quite a while now.
Yeah.
So let's see if any questions come in. Great. If not, we'll call it a night.
Well, we had one that you kind of addressed. How was the New Testament compiled, and were there any relevant books left out? You did,
okay.
Did address that a bit. And then most of what we're dealing with is some audio things, so hopefully we can get that ironed out. And but I'll tell you what, is there, given some of the things that you've talked about here, what are some of the more common things that people will face as they talk about the New Testament, about the canon of the Scripture, those kinds of things that they might face with someone who isn't a believer or who has some opposition to the Scriptures?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there's a common view out there because basically it's the leftovers from the Reformed critics. I mean, the Reformed critics are still around, and there are still even scholars. The Jesus Seminar, for example, they're very much Reformed critics, and they just assume that the New Testament was a collection of stories that finally got written down. And what they assume is every community added their little bit and tried to meet their own personal needs. So it's an assumption, I think, a presupposition, you might say, that these people weren't that interested in accuracy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. But when you start reading what they wrote, what Papias wrote, what Luke wrote, when you start reading those things, it seems to me like, number one, they were intrinsically just very much interested in being accurate. These orderly accounts, and you can see that with other historians. That was part of the order of the day. So I guess in part to answer that question, I say, what can we discern about the motives of the writers of the New Testament? Were they telling a story? Were they trying to make up a new religion? Or was it pretty obvious that they're really trying to be accurate in what they said? And it seems to me that's the case. The very standard of eyewitness testimony itself. We do that in courtrooms, don't we?
Yeah.
So I guess a good summary statement would be, it seems to me that the New Testament was given to us courtroom ready, is the evidence of eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
we can try to discredit those eyewitnesses, but their martyrdom adds a lot to their credibility.
Right. Now, Howard mentions with all the evidence for the historical accuracy of the Bible, what do you believe the main reason that people don't accept it?
Because it's miracles. That's the number one reason that people do not accept the Bible as accurate history. If you took out all the miracles, they probably would, because there really are no, and I've got 8 hours of this stuff. There really are no credible accusations against the plain historical accuracy of the New Testament. We can cover some of those another time, or alleged contradictions or alleged historical errors, but when you look into them, they're just flaky. But as a matter of fact, that's exactly what the original foreign critics had a preconceived worldview. So you think, oh, here's a great example right here. Great example. I'll give you this, and this will be a great kind of a capsule for the thing.
Okay.
All right, Jesus predicted that the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed, right?
Yep.
Right, Matthew,
Yep.
right? All the Gospels probably. So Jesus said, this building is going to, one stone won't be left upon another. Well, that was, he died in 30 A.D. So he would have had to predict that. And if the Gospel of Matthew, let's say, was written before 70 A.D., well, then Jesus is a prophet. That's a miracle. He can tell you what's going to happen in the future. But if we just do not believe in miracles and we do not believe in any kind of prophecy, well, then it couldn't have been written before the actual event. So maybe Matthew wasn't written until after the destruction of Jerusalem, and they embellished what Jesus said to make it look like he was a prophet, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's a presupposition. That's a worldview problem. That's not an evidence problem. That's a worldview problem. So but on the other hand, if we can show good evidence that the book of Matthew had to have been written before the destruction of Jerusalem, then Jesus was a prophet. Jesus could tell you what's going to happen in the future. And that's where the evidence points. But again, I'll go back to the Jesus seminar. Before they ever, and they're scholars, no doubt, they understood the Greek language at least. I don't think they understood much of the Semitic languages. But they did understand the Greek language, but their presuppositions before they ever read a word of the New Testament were these. Number one, Jesus was illiterate. Now, they just assume that. I'm going to guess that if Jesus is the Son of God, he could probably read, but they thought he was illiterate, okay? So they're looking at this purely human presupposition. If he's illiterate, he has no interest in the Old Testament. Now, it's hard for me to imagine a Jewish first-century rabbi who has no interest in the Old Testament and couldn't read it in the first place.
Really?
Really. But that's why for the Jesus seminar, Jesus doesn't look much like a Jewish rabbi. He looks like a Greek cynical philosopher to them. And so if Jesus couldn't read, if he had no interest in the Old Testament, then he had no self-concept as the Messiah. He didn't think of himself as the Messiah at all, according to the Jesus seminar. But all of that is based on a presupposition that there's just no evidence at all for that. Everything Jesus taught was an interpretation of the Old Testament, because that's who he was. First and foremost, he was a first-century Jewish rabbi. And that's why when the Jesus seminar took the New Testament, they took out 80% of the sayings that were ascribed to Jesus, precisely because they were spoken by a first-century Jewish rabbi. Well, Jesus must not have said those. You see the philosophy there. You see how that, and truly that's what happens. I don't think there's any reason not to take it at face value. But anyway, that just shows you how your worldview affects your ability to see things as they are. Even if it couldn't have been said, then it couldn't have been written. Well, there you go.
Okay. We haven't got any other questions, so if you wanted to park it, find a spot to wind it up, and
Yeah.
we'll call it. And
All right. Well, if you're watching, thank you very much. Like I said, this is our first rodeo on YouTube like this, and we hope to do it again. Subscribe, notify us, and put some comments down there so we know what you're thinking as well. And I want to thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you again.
all right. Thanks, y'all. Have a good evening.